The entire executive office went silent when the boss slammed his fist against the conference table and shouted, "Fire her!" A young woman stood frozen beneath the harsh white lights, her hands trembling around an old photograph she had been carrying for years. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks as 30 people stared at her like she was a criminal. She had no idea that within the next 10 minutes, the most powerful man in the company would walk into that room, see the photograph in her hands, and realize that the woman everyone wanted to destroy had been protecting a secret connected to his own family. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can change a life, that people deserve second chances, and that sometimes the person being blamed is the one carrying the greatest burden, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You never know whose heart might need a story like this today. It was a cold Tuesday morning in Chicago, Illinois, when 28-year-old Grace Bennett walked into the headquarters of Hawthorne Global with a small brown envelope pressed against her chest. Grace had worked there for nearly 3 years as an administrative assistant in the executive department. She wasn't rich, she wasn't connected, and she certainly wasn't the kind of person executives usually noticed. She arrived before most employees, left after almost everyone else, and spent her days organizing schedules, preparing documents, answering phones, and quietly solving problems nobody else wanted to deal with. She lived in a modest apartment on the south side of Chicago with her younger brother, Caleb, who was attending community college. Their parents had died years earlier in a highway accident, leaving Grace to become the person who held their little family together. She worked 2 jobs for a while, sold her car when money became tight, and learned how to stretch a grocery budget until every dollar seemed to have a purpose. But Grace had one thing she guarded more carefully than money: a photograph. It was old, slightly faded, and placed inside a wooden frame. In the picture, a smiling young man wearing a military uniform stood beside a little girl with 2 braids. The little girl was Grace. The young man was her older brother, Michael Bennett. Michael had died overseas 12 years earlier. Grace had never allowed herself to forget him. That morning, however, she hadn't brought the photograph because she wanted comfort. She had brought it because she had finally decided she could no longer keep a promise she had made when she was 16. The trouble had started 2 weeks earlier when Grace discovered something strange while preparing documents for an internal audit. Several large payments had been transferred from one of Hawthorne Global's charitable foundations into private accounts. The transactions were carefully disguised, but Grace noticed a repeated signature on the authorization documents. It belonged to Victor Langley, the company's senior operations director. Grace didn't immediately accuse anyone. She knew what happened to employees who challenged powerful people. Instead, she quietly copied the relevant documents and placed them in a secure folder. Then someone discovered what she had done. Her computer was suddenly locked. Her access to confidential files disappeared. And 3 days later, Victor Langley called her into his office. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with silver at his temples and a reputation for making employees cry. He told Grace she had violated company policy by accessing financial records outside her department. He accused her of stealing confidential information. Grace tried to explain that she had been following instructions from the accounting team, but Victor wouldn't listen. Then he gave her a choice: sign a resignation letter and leave quietly, or face an investigation for alleged misconduct. Grace refused to sign. She knew she hadn't stolen anything. She also knew the money she had discovered was connected to something much older than the company. Something connected to Michael. The morning of the confrontation, Grace was summoned to the main executive conference room. When she entered, Victor was already there with several managers. At the far end of the room sat Richard Hawthorne, the company's elderly chairman. His expression was cold and unreadable. Grace barely had time to sit before Victor began accusing her. He claimed she had accessed restricted files, copied confidential information, and attempted to damage the reputation of Hawthorne Global. He even produced printed emails that appeared to prove she had been sharing company information with an outside party. Grace stared at the papers in disbelief. They were fake. Someone had manipulated her email account. She tried to explain, but Victor kept interrupting. Finally, he pointed toward the door and shouted that she was a liability and should be fired immediately. Grace stood there trembling. She could have screamed. She could have begged. Instead, she reached inside her handbag and pulled out the small framed photograph. Her fingers tightened around the wooden frame as she stared at the smiling face of her brother. She whispered under her breath that she was sorry. She had promised Michael she would protect the truth. She had waited 12 years. And now she was terrified she was going to fail him. At that exact moment, the conference room doors opened. Everyone turned. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the 41-year-old billionaire CEO of Hawthorne Global, walked inside. Nathaniel had just returned from a business trip to Seattle. He was known throughout the financial world as an aggressive but brilliant businessman who had transformed his family's struggling company into a global corporation worth billions. But there was something most people didn't know about Nathaniel. He had spent 12 years trying to understand what happened to his younger brother, Michael Hawthorne. Nathaniel stopped walking the moment his eyes landed on Grace. More precisely, his eyes landed on the photograph in her hands. His face changed. The confidence disappeared. The color drained from his cheeks. He walked toward her slowly, as if afraid that one wrong movement would make what he was seeing disappear. Grace looked up at him through tear-filled eyes. Nathaniel stared at the photograph. The young soldier smiled from beneath the glass. Michael Hawthorne, his little brother, dead 12 years ago. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Nathaniel asked Grace where she had gotten the photograph. Grace looked confused by his reaction. She explained that the soldier was her older brother, Michael Bennett. Nathaniel's breathing became shallow. He stepped closer. He asked her what Michael's full name had been. Grace answered, Michael Bennett. Nathaniel shook his head. He said that wasn't his real name. Grace stared at him. Nathaniel told everyone in the room to leave except Grace. Victor protested, but Nathaniel's expression stopped him. One by one, the executives left. When the doors finally closed, Nathaniel sat across from Grace. For the first time, the billionaire CEO looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a grieving younger brother. He told Grace that 12 years earlier, his younger brother Michael had disappeared after joining the military. The family had been told he died during a classified operation overseas. But there had been something strange about the case. Michael's body had never been recovered. Only his identification documents had been returned. The Hawthorne family had spent years searching for answers, but eventually Nathaniel's father had accepted the official report. Nathaniel never did. Grace listened with tears running down her face. Then she opened the wooden frame. Behind the photograph was a tiny folded piece of paper. She explained that Michael had given it to her shortly before he left. He had told her never to show it to anyone unless something happened to him. Grace had kept it hidden for 12 years. She finally unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten message. The paper contained only a few sentences, but they changed everything. Michael had written that he had discovered evidence of financial corruption involving a private company connected to the Hawthorne family. He believed someone inside the corporation was secretly moving charitable funds into hidden accounts. He had also written one final warning. If he disappeared, Grace was never to trust Victor Langley. Nathaniel stared at the name. Victor, the same man who had just demanded Grace's firing. The same man who had controlled the company's financial operations for more than a decade. Nathaniel suddenly understood why Grace had been targeted. She hadn't stolen company information. She had accidentally discovered the same corruption his brother had discovered 12 years earlier. Nathaniel immediately ordered an independent forensic audit. Within hours, investigators uncovered thousands of suspicious transactions. Millions of dollars had been quietly diverted through shell companies over more than a decade. The evidence showed that Victor Langley had been using fake contracts, false invoices, and hidden accounts to steal from the company's charitable foundation. But the biggest discovery came later. Some of the stolen money had been transferred through accounts connected to a private security company operating overseas 12 years earlier. That company had been involved in the operation where Michael Hawthorne disappeared. Nathaniel finally understood. His brother hadn't simply died. He had discovered a criminal network, and someone had spent 12 years making sure the truth remained buried. Victor was arrested before he could leave the country. The executives who had helped him were investigated. The company issued a public statement clearing Grace of every accusation. But Grace didn't care about the headlines. She cared about one thing: Michael. Weeks later, Nathaniel invited Grace to a quiet cemetery outside Chicago. They stood before a memorial stone bearing Michael Hawthorne's name. Grace carried the same photograph. Nathaniel placed a small American flag beside the stone. For the first time in 12 years, he allowed himself to cry. He apologized to Grace for what had happened to her. He told her that if she hadn't been brave enough to keep that photograph and protect her brother's secret, his family might never have known the truth. Grace told him she hadn't done it for money or recognition. She had done it because Michael had once told her that protecting someone didn't always mean standing beside them. Sometimes it meant carrying their memory when nobody else could. Nathaniel never forgot those words. He offered Grace a senior position within the company's charitable foundation, but she initially hesitated. She didn't want to become a symbol or receive sympathy because of what had happened. Nathaniel told her that wasn't why he was offering the job. He said the company needed people who cared more about doing the right thing than protecting their careers. Grace eventually accepted. Over the next year, she helped rebuild the foundation. She created scholarships for military families, emergency assistance programs for children who had lost parents, and financial support for families struggling after unexpected tragedies. And every year, on the anniversary of Michael's death, Grace and Nathaniel returned to the cemetery. They would bring flowers. They would bring the photograph. And they would remember the young man whose final act of courage had taken 12 years to be understood. Months later, Grace received a small envelope at her office. Inside was a photograph. It showed her standing beside Nathaniel at Michael's memorial. On the back, Nathaniel had written that sometimes the people who seem powerless are carrying the strongest stories in the room. Grace smiled as she held it. She finally understood something she had struggled to believe for years. Losing everything doesn't always mean your story is over. Sometimes it means the chapter you've been trapped inside is finally ending. Grace had walked into that conference room believing she was about to lose her job, her dignity, and perhaps the last piece of her brother she had left. Instead, she walked out with the truth. And Nathaniel walked out with something he had been searching for since he was 29 years old. Peace. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that doing the right thing is still worth it, and subscribe for more emotional stories of courage, kindness, and second chances. And before we end, I want to make one special request. Comment, "Truth always wins," below if you believe that no matter how long someone tries to hide the truth, courage and kindness can eventually bring it into the light. Because sometimes, the person standing in front of us with trembling hands isn't the villain. Sometimes, they're the only person brave enough to carry a truth everyone else was too afraid to face. And sometimes, all it takes is one photograph, one promise, and one person willing to refuse to give up for an entire family to finally find peace.